You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
We built a market intelligence platform which provides multinational companies with access to consumer data from emerging markets. My job was basically find us a market in Africa and tell us what product from a portfolio we can roll out in that market, targeting what kind of consumer, at what price point, through which sales channels, and so forth. Language was the biggest barrier that we then identified and went ahead and added now around 54 other languages in the app. So right now we have close to 100,000 mappers and they're spread across the continent.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Joseph Rutakangwa, who is the CEO of Rwazi, which is a market intelligence platform that provides companies with actionable data from an emerging market on who is buying what, for how much, from where, when, and why. Welcome to the podcast, Joseph. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm very, very well. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. Likewise. Can't wait.
Brilliant. So let's get started. I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Joseph Rutakangwa.
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Joseph Rutakangwa. I'm a founder and CEO of a company called Rwazi. I started Rwazi with Eric, and we built a market intelligence platform which provides multinational companies with access to consumer data from emerging markets. And this is data on who is buying what products, for how much, from where, when, and why, to help these companies drive revenue and expand. And the way we capture this data is we use a mobile app and web app and equip that with our network of local consumers across all these emerging markets, who then capture purchase data at buying locations when they're buying different products and services, and also consumption data at home. The consumers get paid for every verified data log, and companies then have access to all this otherwise inaccessible on-the-ground data, and that helps companies deliver hyperlocal packaging, hyperlocal pricing, as well as messaging to drive growth. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm originally from Tanzania. I grew up in so many different countries. Went to primary school in Uganda, spent some time in Kenya. Last years of high school, was fortunate to become an exchange student in the US, in Iowa. That was an absolutely excellent experience. After that, I never had the financial capacity to go to college in the US, despite having a bunch of presidential scholarships. And I didn't want to take debt. I never believed that college education is something worth taking a debt over, and then, being tied up to a debt for 20 years or so. So I just always had my head around getting corporate sponsorships or full scholarships or anything around that lane. Didn't happen after high school. So I decided to start my first business, which was graphic design and video production. I was very successful with it earlier on in the US, went back to Tanzania. The problem was the purchasing power in Tanzania is 10x lower than what you have in the US, even more in some areas. So the amount that people were paying wasn't sufficient to cover my costs. I was doing, weddings, church events, making logos, doing videos, and so forth. But people would mostly pay 50% up front. They won't finish up the rest and so forth. So I got a lot of cash flow problems and decided that the business wasn't worth it. So I ended up closing it, tried to get a job. In Africa, there's a huge thing of having a degree certificate. So I didn't have a degree at a point. So I couldn't get a job despite, having all the expertise and software and so forth. So I ended up deciding to, move over into the development space, where I started my own community development projects to help essentially the problem that I always saw since then was you have a lot of young people who have graduated from college or even, some sort of other tertiary education. They don't have jobs. It takes 3 to 5 years to get jobs in most countries in Africa. And you have space. You have a lot of space. You have a lot of land in countries like Tanzania, but you don't have the resources for irrigation and other resources that's needed, supply chain resources and so forth to drive agriculture. So I just focused onto that to build development projects. Didn't work for myself because I was young. There's a lot of ageism. So I had to join the UN, as a volunteer, which now started working in my favor, ended up doing a lot of development projects through the UN. From there, I moved to Indonesia and other countries, training people to do the same. Subsequently, was fortunate to go to Lehigh University through the postgraduate program, which is where I found my passion for consulting and started consulting. From there. It took 8 years of consulting for multinationals. And that's where I found the problem of consumer data, of lack of consumer data and market data in Africa that eventually drove me to starting Rwazi.
Fantastic. So you've given us great insights into yourself and into what Rwazi does and how and why you started it. I was wondering if we could look specifically, you've touched upon this slightly in terms of, can you tell us why you decided to create a platform to address the data gap in Africa?
Yes. So during my years in consulting, spent 8 years doing this before starting Rwazi. The most common problem across different sectors, consulting for companies, in the beginning, it was energy, healthcare, transportation, and then eventually started having a concentration in consumer packaged goods. The most common problem was that we didn't have access to consumer data. My job was basically find us a market in Africa and tell us what product from a portfolio we can roll out in that market, targeting what kind of consumer, at what price point, through which sales channels, and so forth, right? And distribution partners or local partners that they could work with, etc. The issue was that there isn't anything online that will give you any sort of indication for any metrics that you'd need to successfully decide on which market and to roll out what products and how to do that. So we subsequently turned to national bureaus of statistics, ministries of trade and commerce and so forth. But these bodies didn't have the data either. If they had any data, it would be 5-10 years old. Also, it would be very limited or inaccurate, etc. So we decided to turn again to the private sector, looked at traditional market research firms. The issue with market research firms, we had all the, across the years, I had all the top, brands in that space. The problem is they use, the panel model, which is, you'd get a panel of, let's say, 50 consumers in Lagos. You'd make sure you're sampling it well, and then you'd use that panel to get the insights on what those consumers are experiencing and buying and so forth, and then extrapolate on a city of 15 million, right? And then a country of 100 million and so forth. The problem is that it's never intended for on-ground use. So one, you have, from there you have this 100-page report that tells you the macro trends and then tells you what consumers think and so forth, but that's not actionable. So an on-ground sales representative or trade marketing coordinator can't actually use any of what you get from that kind of research, from panel-based research, to execute. It doesn't tell them where is the actual location of a retailer where they need to put the product, or where do consumers who buy a certain product size at a certain price actually live, what are the actual price point across the entire range, neighborhood profiles. It doesn't tell them anything that's actionable, right? So after testing, going over so different models for years, along the way I met Eric, we found that the only model that works is equipping consumers with a correctly set app that would enable them to log when they buy products at retail outlets, and also log products they're using in their homes and log it correctly. So there's a huge aspect, there's a huge process innovation that you had to run in the background to make sure it works, make sure we can pay consumers correctly and on time, to make sure we can capture data correctly and verify it and do all of that within minutes, etc., etc. So that's the model that we found that it works. Get the data from the horse's mouth, and immediately the companies would access this data and execute. So you have the actual locations of all these important sales channels. You have actual locations based on pricing. You have heat maps based on pricing and sizes and so forth. And that helps companies actually execute from the data perspective, rather than just having a 100-page report that's like text heavy and just focusing on macro trends.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that you started Rwazi to address the data gap you faced whilst working in consulting. So I was hoping you could elaborate on how this data actually helps companies to, I guess, drive revenue or expand in African markets.
Yes. So you have two different profiles of companies. So profile A is companies which already they have presence in African markets. And this is just not limited to African markets. You have Africa, you have South Asia right now, and Latin America. So for companies, they already have presence in African markets. The challenge is they're struggling in the market, they're struggling to capture more market share. They are being outcompeted by either other multinational companies or local businesses and brands. So their need is they have the resources, right? They have the financial resources. They can add human capital and other resources to execute. They just don't know what levers to move to drive more revenue, right? Is it pricing? Am I pricing incorrectly in different cities and neighborhoods in the cities and so forth? Am I placing my products in wrong retail locations? Because they don't have visibility in any of that. The visibility kind of ends for physical products, ends at large distribution centers. For services, they would be struggling to roll out competitive, for instance, in internet data packages. There's a huge data war in countries like Nigeria and Kenya and so forth. So there's a lot of they don't have visibility on what exact value proposition consumers want and how much they're going to pay for and so forth. And you have the second group, which is companies that do not have any presence at all. They have decided which countries they want to expand to, or they want to figure that out, and they have already substantial investments to do so. So in both groups, the data we provide is data from consumers. So it's consumer insight data. So you have two groups, consumer insight data and then retail data for physical products. For consumer insight data, it's data on what consumers are using today and their purchasing patterns, where they buy products in terms of proximity, profile of the sales channels and so forth, why they're buying products from those channels, why they prefer certain brands, why they buy. So on a practical level, you can find the distance from where they frequently buy X products, the other products that are available in those locations, the price points, of the product they're buying versus others, the sizes, the frequency of purchase, the number of users in their homes that they have for that product, their earnings, and we have huge data points on these consumers, their earnings, whether they have kids and so forth. And all of this is verifiable, right, by images that are geo-stamped and time-stamped and so forth. So you can have that weekly trends and understand their patterns. And this helps companies to build and send their sales teams to if it's a retail data subscription, to help them understand the important retail outlets that would sell their products. So these retail outlets would be selling competitor products. So now I know they're selling competitor products at this price that's in the same range, the same size, same flavors, and so forth. So I'm going to send my sales team at these locations to do what they call listing in the CPG world. If it's a service business, for instance, some of our companies are global telecom companies, global credit card companies, and so forth. What they look for is, now I know that these consumers are using this mobile data package because of X, Y, and Z. So now they can do hyperlocal messaging to target a value proposition that aligns with what consumers in that specific location value. And that increases the marketing ROI, because now you're not just messaging what you think based on 50 consumers on your panel, but it's based on tens of thousands of consumers and more in a city, right? So you identify important retail location, you put your product there because consumers within 100 meters from that location are buying your competitor product because of the same reason that your product is actually greater. You're delivering hyperlocal messaging, through marketing to drive conversions. And then the most important part there is you can adjust your prices and package sizes based on consumers in different localities. So, for instance, right now, since last year, we've had, for the last 3 years, actually, we've had huge supply chain disruptions. And then last year, inflation just hit so many African countries, in the ranges of 30%, 40%, and so forth. It's not that when inflation hits, consumers will just go for cheaper products. Other consumers just prefer the same brands that they're using, but at a smaller size, right? But most of these companies, they just don't have the data on what correct sizes to send to which cities, which towns, right? Which localities within those cities. And that gap, that mismatch of correct or incorrect sizes at incorrect prices lets them, lose market share and so forth. Because now you have all these local brands that are just serving, 500-meter radiuses and so forth, capture those pockets. So with Rwazi, companies are able to identify all of that and execute. So hyperlocal messaging, hyperlocal pricing, and packaging through identifying correct allocations for retailers and consumers. That's exactly the levers the companies are able to move with Rwazi data to grow their revenues.
Fantastic. So you've clarified how you add value to companies and the type of data that you provide, which obviously differentiates what you do in comparison to your competitors. I know you use a model which incorporates, is it mappers?
Yes.
To gather the data.
Yeah.
So for the people listening who aren't familiar with what that is, what is a mapper and what do they do for you at Rwazi?
So mappers are local consumers in all the countries that will capture data. And in the end, all consumer-facing companies are selling to end consumers. They're B2C. They're not selling to retailers, although, in a general model, it looks like the technical endpoint ends at retail. But they're targeting end consumers. So with our model, we identify that you want to get data directly from the end consumers who are buying these products from retail locations or for service companies from the website. And what mappers are, they're all those end consumers for these companies. And because they're local consumers where companies would be targeting specific demographics and so forth, we use mappers' own default purchase spending pattern and so forth to log that, and that gives a correct picture of where they buy products from, how much they spend, why they're buying certain brands, etc., etc. So mappers are not, we don't prompt mappers to go to, let's say, go to X retail location and check for brand X. No. It's as you go about your normal grocery shopping routine. Let's say you decide to go and buy cooking oil, or you decide to go and buy soda or powder milk and so forth. Then you log the product that you bought and other products that were there and the prices and so forth at retail locations. And when you're at home, you log the products that you have, lotions, food products, beverages, etc., etc. And that is with images. So that gives us, today, these are the products you have in your home. This is how frequent you're restocking them. And this is where you're restocking them from, and the prices and so forth. So that entire picture every month throughout the year is painted through the default existence rather than being prompted from our end. So that's what the mappers are.
Thank you for sharing that. So how many mappers do you currently have in Africa?
So right now we have close to 100,000 mappers.
Oh, wow.
And they're spread in both urban and rural areas in different countries across the continent.
So would you say having mappers is essential for gathering data within African markets?
Yes. You want to gather data from consumers. You can't gather data without consumers. Imagine Facebook without users. That's what this is. All companies want data from consumers. from the actual buyers of their competitor products or buyers of their own products. So you have to have consumers feed you with data on their purchases and so forth, and fairly pay them so they have a correct incentive, which is actually getting paid in exchange for that data, right? So we acquire data directly from consumers, starting from their profile all the way to their purchase patterns and the products they buy and so on, and so forth, directly from the consumers themselves. So you can't run a consumer data business without consumers. Otherwise, you'd be doing what most platforms have done traditionally, which is get consumer data from social platforms from a third angle, right? Which is, as Joseph looks at, let's say, Zara shirt ads and interacts with them, then I deduce from there. So data is implied. And you don't compensate Joseph and so forth. In this case, companies do not assign a lot of value to that data. They assign a lot of value to, I want to know exactly how much Joseph is earning. I want to know exactly when they're making the move of buying, in this case, let's say, I don't know, Jameson or any of those other products, or Safaricom, mobile data packages and so forth. I want to know exactly when they make the moves and when they make the purchases. And then I know exactly how much they're spending. I can align my product in their path to generate more revenue. It's first-hand data from the actual person you're targeting to drive sales.
Brilliant. So you mentioned that you incentivize mappers through payment. So do you find that these incentives for mappers differ in terms of mappers in regions outside of Africa?
They're actually the same. We run a lot of tests in the beginning on the types of incentives. We tested out the point model, didn't work, tested out prices, doesn't work. We tried gamifying all sorts of way. None of that worked in most of the global south. The most common model that drives a lot of engagement is cash payments. And these payments, of course, we use a lot of fintech payment infrastructure to get it directly to the consumers in the shortest period of time. Right now, it takes around a day. Within 24 hours, they have their payments for verified logs. They all have this similar, they assign the same value to cash. So whether it's India, whether it's Colombia, whether it's Nigeria, they value cash. And they value cash when it arrives fast. They do not appreciate the traditional concept of, you have 1,000 points, you'll get a gift card from Amazon. No, none of that works. You need actual hard cash. It needs to be delivered, through Momo or M-Pesa or any of that directly into their phones as fast as possible.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So if we look closer at the mappers outside of the incentives and look at the data that they gather, how do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data collected by your network of mappers?
Yes. So we have a very, very, very long string of verifications. The first one, when you're installing our app and signing up, doesn't automatically qualify you as a consumer, capture data for Rwazi, right? So you have to go through a qualifying process, which is verifying all your demographic data. This is, education, employment, salary, people you have in your home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you verify that the same way you do a bank KYC. So there's if you've used banking apps, they have a relatively fast KYC process, just a 15-minute process where you just upload your verified documents. We do image to text recognition. You do facial recognition and a bunch of other things like that to verify your identity and whether what you're claiming is the case or not. Because otherwise, it would be anyone can claim to earn any amount and can claim to have a postgraduate and so. But how do you prove that that's the case, right? So we have that verification in the beginning to qualify the consumers. Then afterwards, for every single log that's made, we have a very long string of verifications heavily on geolocation data. So geolocation data is the heaviest because most of the purchase locations in the continent, 98% of them are informal retail outlets, right? Cash-based informal retail outlets that do not have an address system that you find in the UK or in the US and the like. They're completely invisible and they change all the time. So you'd have, I don't know, road constructions, or the person just moves to a different place and so forth. So that's the whole addressing infrastructure that we've built for ourselves. That helps us find them, update the locations and so forth with high degrees of accuracy. So on every submission, retail locations that are geofenced, the geodata is collected for every single data point in a submission. Timestamps are made, images are taken for products. We have image to text recognition for that, etc., etc. So that's all of those strings verify. So we have in-app, that's done in-app. Then the submission is allowed to be made. Then that's done throughout our back end before it gets to the dashboards that the companies access through subscriptions. So we have a lot of strings. We have a lot of VPN blockers. So you can't be in Ibadan or Kano and then act as if you're in Abuja or Lagos, right? We have very, very, very tight VPN blockers, IP blockers. You can't have your phone and give it to someone else to act as if they're you. So there's a whole string of verifications that ensure that the data we're getting is 100% accurate. And that's what's driving our growth, because what consumers, I was the buyer of the data, for 8 years. So I know exactly what to look for. I've bought a lot of insufficient or inaccurate data from, large, whether it's government bodies or traditional research companies. So I know exactly what to look for in our customers. We built it directly from what our customers are valuing and what they're using it for. So the string of verification is what our customers value the most: speed, coverage, verification. That's what they value the most.
Awesome. So you've detailed how you gather and build the reliable data sets that you collect. So if you look at the data collectors, the mappers, what challenges have you faced in building and maintaining a network of mappers?
Yeah, there have been a lot of challenges and a lot that we didn't anticipate. The biggest one being language. So in Africa, you have a lot of English-speaking countries and French-speaking countries, and then some Portuguese-speaking, Arabic-speaking, and so forth. So for these countries, we assumed that if it's an English-speaking country, then everyone speaks English, so we can have our app in English, and voila, it's done. And then we started building our early, network of mappers. It was working well. Then essentially expand through word of mouth, and then that was working well. And then last year we started expanding, at a higher rate, and then saw that we're having limitations in the expansion of the network. Only to find out that limitations are because even people in English-speaking countries aren't comfortable with English. And the type of English isn't US English that you'd find in the app, right? So language was the biggest barrier that we then identified, and went ahead and added now around 54 other languages in the app. And it will be, by next month, we'll have more than 100. I think it's around 147 or something around that in the app. And that allows for all sorts of, right now we have Uganda, you have Kenya, Rwanda, you have all sorts of things, Swahili, if you want. So all sorts of things. So the app is localized. And that enables consumers, that enables our reach to consumers, not just the ones who have undergrad and they're living in massive cities and so forth, but all consumers of different levels, and in townships, in rural areas and so forth. So greater expansion there. The other challenge was payouts. How do you roll out a complicated payout system across Africa where, there's nothing more fragmented in the world? This is not actually just Africa, in the world. There's nothing more fragmented than the payout infrastructure. And I never knew this, but what are all these fintech companies doing if payout is still, we've seen, especially in Africa, everyone has raised through fintech. I'm like, what are you guys doing, right? I can tell you right now, the only fintech solution that's true, that's real and doing its job is Flutterwave, right? Flutterwave is the only fintech company that has the widest infrastructure covering all channels. So this is banking, this is all, mobile networks in all the countries where it's applicable, all banks in every single country where they have serious speeds. They're the only ones with an actual working payout infrastructure across Africa.
Interesting.
All other companies, I have no idea what's going on in that space. They don't have it's just nothing. Nothing's working. Now, almost all companies can do payouts in Nigeria, right?
Yes.
But either Nigeria or Kenya or just talk at South Africa. That's it. People just can't do payouts. Like no one has figured out payouts other than FatWave, which is on the correct coverage and correct expansion path. So that was our biggest problem. Right now we use FatWave primarily because they have the best infrastructure and it works. But we bandage with other payout solutions in other countries around the world. So Asia has different ones. So there are the ones that works in India, they don't work in Indonesia. The ones that work in Philippines, they don't work in Colombia. So you have to do multi-layered payout infrastructure. Absolute nightmare, right? For addressing system, we had to build our own. So we have our own address system with AI coupled with satellite imaging and so forth to correctly have our addresses that work and geofence every single location. So we have a lot of infrastructural problems that we had to solve across the years and some that we're still solving to get this thing running properly at correct speeds.
Thank you for that. So you highlighted the challenges of various payout systems and various languages in Africa. I know you have a focus on various industries. Could you provide some examples of, say, how Rwazi has used its data to influence decision-making in the sectors that you operate in?
Yes. Biggest base of our customers are coming from primary sectors that are consumer-facing. So you have consumer goods, consumer healthcare, telecom, and financial services. These are the key consumer-facing sectors where we have our customers. The large majority, of course, is in consumer goods. We have a secondary majority in financial services, telecommunications, and consumer healthcare. The needs are the same. They're all getting data on the same thing. So what people are buying could be milk, or could be mobile data packages, or could be banking products, right? It's the same. It's just on one hand, it's a product. On the other hand, it's a service. And then you have, where they're buying this from. It could be pharmacies or retail locations or online. Like for mobile data packages, or you're buying it either online or through USSD, which is text and so forth, right? Mobile text and so forth. And then you have, how frequent, why, and so forth, which this is the same data points on usage patterns, buying patterns, pricing, and so forth that help any of these companies in these sectors find the data that they need to execute. We have anomalies in our customer group where we have companies, for instance, that are tracking services, but they're non-profit organizations. So they're tracking services to roll out products, but without the intentional profits. For instance, one of our customers, Japanese non-profit, tracking utilities. So this is access to water, electricity in rural Uganda. They're rolling out, the pay as you fetch and such sources in rural Uganda, and they're financing that themselves. In the NGO world, it's the exact same dashboard, it's the exact same model. The only difference is that for them, they don't call them local consumers, they call them target beneficiaries, and they're tracking the same services. Because in the end, even if it's WHO, you're still tracking medicine. If it's the World Food Program, you're still tracking food, access to food and adequate prices and so forth. So the metrics, the data points that are being tracked are the same regardless of industries and sectors, but the use cases of this data are different. I'll give you an example. For instance, we have financial service companies like PE firms that are tracking consumer products because they're tracking the demand of products for their portfolio companies. So when they want to, they're assessing which businesses to continue investing in and so forth. They're looking at how their products are performing on the market and then deciding, projecting how the businesses will perform and so forth. So there's a whole range of use cases on what businesses use this data for. But the primary use case is the one for driving on-ground sales and increasing market share and so forth for the businesses that are actually selling these products.
Fantastic. So for the data to influence decision-making, it must be actionable. I know you touched on this earlier, but I was wondering if you could go into more detail in terms of how do you ensure that once the data is collectible, it is also actionable in an African context?
For us here, the biggest thing is geolocation. If geolocation helps sales teams to execute, to physically drive up to whether you're using motorbikes or delivery teams and so forth, to drive up to retail locations to actually execute a sale or deliver a product. So you get correct geo data. And the other reason for geolocation is to know where consumers are. So you do targeted marketing campaigns. These are, this is whether it's on-ground activations or, trade marketing activities and so forth, or it's online marketing activities, because then you target the correct location based on the value propositions, the prices, what consumers have in their homes, right? Because now you have geolocation data for that. So these are the two main things. The other actions, our job is to provide the data, right? To provide it at speed, great coverage, and 100% verified. What companies are going to do with the data, that's of course up to the companies themselves. They already have, all the subscribers already have their own angles on executing on this data. The executing windows are a week to a month, within a week to a month, where they choose, for instance, the SKU situation where you have, let's say, 1 liter Fanta in an area which buys the 330 milliliter or 500 ml Fanta. It's a quick execution of change the distribution of SKUs to the 500 milliliter Fanta rather than the 1 liters in this specific area, because that's what consumers are buying. People are buying Fanta pineapple, or they're buying, Fanta pineapple. You better find a Mirin that goes, that competes directly with that variant of Fanta, right? So you have a lot of situations where people's flavors or sizes or, brand preferences. Like, I'll give you an example of what we found so interesting. Like, for instance, in the milk space, people buy sachets, like 25 gram sachets. In this case, it's mostly in congested places like Lagos. People prefer imported brand, but small SKUs like sachets, 25 gram packs in a belt. They have a string of users for that, and the way they use, and there's a certain farming profile that buys that, etc., etc. So you're a company, you're exporting, you're pushing 250 grams, 500 grams, a kilo of powder milk, and no one is buying it. And you're wondering what's going on, and you're looking at your competitors, they're moving volume. What's going on? Well, your competitors, you use the data, only to find out your competitors are pushing 25 grams in huge numbers. So if you don't have 25 grams in your portfolio, you start pushing the smallest package you have while you make the 25 gram available maybe in 3 months or 6. And then you start switching. We've had companies do that, and they immediately see like 35% growth in sales in those locations in between 3 to 6 months. So you see huge bumps because you're doing that hyperlocal execution with the data.
You've touched on this, but I was hoping we could go into a bit more detail. So from the data that you've collected, what are some of the most interesting consumer habits that you've observed from African consumers?
Yes. The first one I would say is African consumers, they don't change their habits much as they earn more, right?
Oh.
Yeah. So it's not that, which is a massive misconception that most multinational companies coming from US, Europe assume that if consumers are earning, let's say $2,000, which is massive in most African countries, right? Earning $2,000, $3,000 a month, or even $1,000, they will buy from supermarkets. No, they will not. They will still go to local markets and the neighborhood shop. Why do they still go to the neighborhood shop? Because I just want to buy from John because we go to church together, or, I just want to buy from, so I'm buying from people I know. I'm not going to buy from ShopRite just because I'm earning more right now, right? And I don't want to drive miles. So that's one. Two, they still don't do bulk purchase. Still at $2,500 a month or, $1,500, consumers will not stock for a month, right? So then they're not going to say one Sunday or Saturday, I'm just going to hit a department store and then buy all my groceries for the month. No, they're still going to buy a liter at a time. They're still going to buy everything as they need them, right? So the purchase frequency is more often in small amounts as needed. They still are not going to buy things like meat, fresh foods, and so forth from local markets because they value that more than heavily processed, packed or frozen foods, right? So there's still like a huge inclination to organic foods. And there's a very certain palette of taste that they have that doesn't change with increase in earnings. But you have other interesting aspects. For instance, in the alcohol space, for instance, consumers will still go for very premium whiskey brands and vodka brands and so forth. That doesn't necessarily match their income levels. And they estimate that same thing applies in mobile data. You'd think someone who is earning, let's say, $400 a month won't afford a $40, $50 per month data package. Well, that's what they go for. So there's a huge premium assigned to internet speeds, the amount of GBs they get, and so forth, despite earnings. So they assign huge proportion of their earnings towards those things. And this depends on whether they are single or they're married, whether they have kids or not, whether it's a guy or a woman. 80% of purchases are done by women, right? For all these grocery products. So that depends on all those demographic factors, but there's still high assignment of value to things like mobile data packages, for streaming and so forth. For men in certain countries like Uganda and South Africa, high premium assigned to alcohol despite earnings and so forth. So you have all these huge differences in behavior that if you copy paste the use behavior of a consumer in France or the US, you fall flat on your face if you come in Africa. And African markets are different. So the way Kenyan consumer behaves completely different from the way like a Ugandan consumer, Nigerian consumer will behave.
Yes.
And, where they will frequent and so forth. So I have a lot of that.
Yes. You've touched on some interesting consumer habits, which you could say are linked to cultural habits. Given the diverse cultures and markets that you cover, how do you navigate, say, cultural sensitivities and nuances while collecting data?
Yes, I think for us, what we've built and what we continuously iterate towards is making the app localized to different consumers based on their base, right? And the most important thing here is you have things like languages, and then the way the data is collected changes. So we use AI to get that done. So it's not a manual process. So the way the data is collected in different areas is adjusted, changes based on the demographic. And the demographic is tied to culture and so forth. Is adapted based on their demographic and profile, right? Demographic profile, and that's tied to their culture and nuanced patterns. This is everything from religion, everything from the type of products they buy and how they buy them, how they use the product, all of that. You see their culture expressed in all those patterns. And what we do is we adapt our platform to just merge as much as possible, even the way we collect the data to merge as much as possible. There are things that we're still working towards, things like converting voice to text, which would enable certain consumers provide more data through voice. So they'll provide more data, whether it's product feedback and so forth, through voice, and that will be converted to text and data points for the companies. And you have a lot of differences. For instance, you have consumers who are buying products from retail outlets on credit. So that's a completely different avenue, right? Different purchase style. That's based on culture, because that's like, because why can they buy it on credit when they don't have any collateral or anything like that? Because they know John and maybe they work together, they go church together. So John knows that this person is a primary school teacher. They earn this much every month, so they'll just repay at the end of the month and start a new account, like a new account of debt, grocery debt. So you have all of those completely new. You won't get groceries on debt in the US, right?
No.
So completely new behaviors that are specific. And you have things like, how sometimes cooking oil, they actually do not sell a packed. So you have selling 1 liter, 500 ml and so forth. And then you have consumers buying cooking oil by like by a pint, right? So maybe it's 25 milliliters or 30 milliliters. So how do you now measure that, right?
Yes.
So you have all of that, all those nuances. You have tabletops, which are not, physical location shops. These are just tables. And someone can just change location tomorrow, right? So how do you account for all of that when you're building infrastructure? And those are the small, very informal and on-ground granular nuances that we've incorporated in our system.
Amazing, amazing. So it's clear that your data is making an impact in the sectors that you operate. What would you say is potentially the long-term impact of the data collected on the development of some of these markets in terms of understanding consumer behavior?
Yes. So one thing that's a big trend is that, as you know, Africa has the youngest population, fastest growing population in the world. 1 in 4 people will be African in the next 20 to 30 years. So this is a very important thing. The African middle class increasing isn't based on the growth of the local economies, the relevant economies. No. It's based on the fact that they can now work online and earn from outside the economies, get paid by American companies, European companies, other African companies, and so forth, regardless of their location. So that's what's driving the increase in earnings. So there's increasing earnings, huge growth in population, younger population, and so forth. So companies are realizing, companies in Europe or Japan and US and so forth, and other multinationals in Africa, they're realizing that because the population is aging where they're at, you're seeing this is where there's a huge threat, the whole 1 generation or 2 of consumers who will buy their products. They're young, so the products are relevant to them, whereas baby products and so forth, they have the earnings and that earning portion is growing and they have the numbers, right? So this is where the target is. So because of that, companies are now paying attention on the preferences of these consumers. So the long-term consumers are now starting now and will eventually get more access to products that are tailored to them. What has been happening is you have, a French company sell a French product in Senegal without changing anything about the product, which, people just are forced to just buy if they like the brand, just buy whatever product the brand offers. Now, the brand is spending in R&D to build products for those consumers because now they're representing a growing chunk. So consumers are getting products that are tailored to them at prices that are good for them, at packages and sizes and so forth, and getting those products closer to where they live. So you don't have to, go all the way to a city center or, big market and so forth to find the product. They're now bringing products closer and closer as they have location data. The other thing is companies are now investing more in those markets. So investing in, hiring and so forth to just expand the operation in those markets, which is driving jobs and a bunch of things around that area. So for us, that's what we see as a huge impact, where, the immediate impact is consumers are getting paid to log the data, and that's good, driving, getting all these multi-billion dollar companies to actually spend on data acquisition, accurate data acquisition. But the long term is on top of that, you now get the product that you want that's tailored for you, closer to your home, at a correct price, and so forth.
Fantastic. So you've touched on the impact of your data and also the current trends you're seeing from African consumers. So if we look past current trends and into the future, where do you see Africa's consumer data collection space in, say, 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think the data space, we are doing a huge change in how the data is collected. There's already high internet penetration and smartphone penetration and app usage comprehension and so forth. So we'll see more consumers tap into this to make their voices heard, to completely influence how brands interact with them. So we'll see a huge growth in that, and that will drive more growth into other areas such as micro-influencing and brand interaction and so forth. So that's growing towards that trend. And also, how we position ourselves in that is because we have the widest network of local consumers in all the way from urban to the most remote places, we see ourselves as expanding further into 1 million, 10 million plus consumers across all these countries and on the continent, and making it easier and easier to log the data. So we'll have new things coming up later this year, next year, where we're having more integrations into how consumers are logging data to enable them to log more data faster with less hassle. So that's where the trend is going.
I look forward to seeing how things develop and also the part that Rwazi will play in that space. Exciting. Thank you. Thank you for that, Joseph.
Awesome.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, even African proverbs and affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yes. I have a quote that I like. It goes, "He who hesitates is lost." The reason I love that saying is because in the startup world, there's a lot of uncertainty and unknown variables. And this could cause founders to hesitate and want to spend more time in market validation or product iteration or building correctly and so forth before launching. And he who hesitates is lost is a lesson we had where we got to a point that we had to choose either not launch and not do this, or just go ahead and launch with whatever resources and product we had at the time. And we decided the latter. We just made decisions fast, decided to launch and go to market like extremely fast early on. And that's what enabled us to grow to this point. And, throughout the years, we've done this exact same decision speed, which is get to crossroads. You either do more with less and jump, or you just wait and potentially die because you don't have resources. And I think all founders can take from this and prioritize making decisions fast rather than waiting.
I like that one. Thank you for sharing it with us, Joseph. So, as we're coming to the close of today's conversation, I was wondering, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing?
Yes. I invite them to contact us at hello@rwazi.com. The most important thing I would mention is to not make assumptions about consumers and what consumers want. Just because you're a consumer doesn't necessarily mean a million other people are behaving the same way. Just because you're from X culture, let's say, just because you're Nigerian doesn't mean you understand Nigerian consumers. And likewise for all other, countries and cultures. It's important to use actual data from your target consumers and tailor your product offering, pricing, and so forth towards that. That's how you fix this he who hesitates is lost. Fix that kind of problem and get correct ROI for your business. So I invite them to contact us at hello@rwazi.com, and we'll be happy to provide them, help them access this data and grow their businesses.
Perfect. That has been an insightful, informative conversation, Joseph. Thank you for shedding light on the significance of market intelligence in driving positive change and growth. I think your vision for a more connected and informed Africa is truly commendable, and I look forward to witnessing the continued growth of Rwazi. So thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This was a great interview.
It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and we will speak soon.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.